Hi, class. A couple of announcements for week 5. So, as we head into this next week, I want to, before we talk about this week, just go back for a minute and talk about 3 different concepts that we discussed in week 4. If you recall, hyperinflation, inflation, and stagflation, and several of you discussed these in your assignments. So I think it's important that we say a couple of things about these, just so we are 100% clear on what they are and the differences, right? So inflation, right? Inflation is the general increase in prices. It's a general increase in the price level, okay? Usually measured by the consumer price index. But let's not confuse the increase in one price or the increase in some prices with the general increase in the price level, which is the definition of inflation. We also have different types of inflation. We have demand pull inflation, which is the inflation that happens when the demand for goods or services exceeds production, right? We also have cost push inflation, which is when the production costs increase, and as a result, the producers have to increase their prices, right? And this is associated often with supply shocks, like oil prices, for example, going up, right? So that's cost push inflation. It's in fact, very dangerous because it's a harder one to manage. And then you have built-in inflation, and this is when prices rise, wages rise, for example, in order to maintain living costs, right? So, and the reason wages rise is because wages are prices. Wages are just another price in the economy. And employers have to increase their wages because workers will not be willing to work for lower wages given the increase in prices. Of course, if there's an oversupply of labor, then prices for wages, remain sticky. And this creates an even worse problem, right? Because you have inflation, higher prices, but lower wages or constant wages, what we call sticky wages. And this creates a terrible situation because workers are unable to meet the minimum goods and services. Okay, now that's inflation. Hyperinflation is another concept that we discussed, and hyperinflation is just runaway inflation. It's very fast and usually inflation that's 50% or higher. And we've seen examples of hyperinflation all over the world, in Europe, in Germany, in places in Africa, Brazil, Argentina, but Nicaragua had hyperinflation in the 1980s. In fact, here you see this is a note for 1,000 Cordobas, right? 1,000 Cordobas, which has you can see this stamp of 1 million Cordobas stamped on it. And so this is an example of hyperinflation when in fact the government didn't even print bills with the new denomination. They simply just stamped the old bills with the new amount, the new value, because prices were going up so fast and the cost of printing was so high. So hyperinflation completely eats away from our purchasing power. Some of the worst cases in the last few years in America have been seen in Venezuela, for example, where when workers get paid, they immediately go and purchase goods because money loses value almost instantaneously. Then you have stagflation. So stagflation is an interesting concept. And stagflation occurs when you have inflation accompanied with low growth or no growth. In fact, shrinking of the economy. So GDP shrinks, right? inflation goes up, and so you get the term, right, the combined inflation and stagnant growth, you get stagflation. But it's important to note that this happens when usually during the recessionary part of the business cycle. So when you are in a recession, you are likely to find stagflation. Obviously, in the expansionary periods, you're not likely to find stagflation because GDP is growing. In recessions, you have stagnant or low GDP or shrinking GDP. You have and this is significant, right? Significant shrinking of the GDP or low GDP, right? Not, it has to be significant. Unemployment tends to go up because there's no demand for labor or low demand for labor. There is also a drop in aggregate demand for goods and services, which adds on also to the unemployment because firms will not employ workers if there is no demand for their products. So you have that happen, and when there is low demand for goods and services and for labor, then you also end up with often with cost push inflation because there is no demand for goods and services, but suppliers, because of the shortages that are produced from firms cutting their output, you end up with cost push inflation as a result of shrinking supplies of goods and services in the economy. So very dangerous and complicated situation in stagflation. Okay, this week, what's on the calendar for this week? For this week, we have, please read chapters 14, 15, and 16. Please watch Dr. T's lecture. Please watch the other videos that are also provided. You will need some of those for the writing assignment, which is due day 7. Now, on the writing assignment, a couple of things, reminders. Remember that you are to analyze the various alternatives to public provision and production of K through 12 education. So that's the general idea. Include advantages and disadvantages, the effect of wealth on communities, the impact of wealth on demand for education. In doing so, you are to locate a minimum of 4 peer-reviewed articles, okay? So I'm going to be looking out for those 4 peer-reviewed articles. Your paper should include a thesis or a main point, and make sure that you close with a summary paragraph. As always, for work turned in, remember to use correct APA format. And what I'm looking for is something in the 2 to 4 pages in length, not including the cover and not including the references, right? So, something that's minimum of 2, maximum of 4, right? So that should be okay. Again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. Write me an email, and I'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions. Okay? Take care, and God bless.